Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's ACPE Academy webinar. My name is Mark Medwed, and I'm the Program Manager at the ACPE. Today, we are continuing our webinar series focused on spiritual care of the non-religious, presented by the Reverend Mary Martha Teal, who is the Director of Clinical Pastoral Education at Hebrew Senior Life Hebrew Rehabilitation Center in Boston, Massachusetts. Today's webinar, Teaching Spiritual Care of the Non-Religious, is being recorded and will be available for playback from the ACPE Academy webpage for members of ACPE. Additionally, the slide presentation will also be available for future reference. At the conclusion of the presentation today, there will be an opportunity for you to submit questions. If you move your mouse on your screen, you will see a Q&A button. Click on that button to type your question. Due to the potentially high number of questions that will be asked, not all questions will necessarily be answered as part of the webinar. It is now my pleasure to introduce our presenter today, the Reverend Mary Martha Teal.
It's nice to be back with all of you, my colleagues. And as Mark said, this is part 2 of a conversation. And I hope that some of you were able to be here for part 1, which was really the introduction of spiritual care of the non-religious. I want to say thanks to ACPE for offering this material and to Mary Redner Robinson, who wrote articles about this topic with me, and especially to the Louisville Institute, which provided a pastoral study grant that allowed me to do some of this work. So today, we're going to focus on teaching. Here's just a fun cartoon. The one rat who's hooked up to electrodes is saying to the other rat who's not hooked up, "I'm not religious, just anti-science." So we know that by the time this theme gets to the New Yorker cartoon section, it is a wide part of our culture's conversation. And the awareness of the growth of this group, this huge set of groups really, is quite broad. So today I am again talking about people who would consider themselves secular, unaffiliated, persons who combine practices from a variety of traditions, people who say they're nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who say they're duns, D-O-N-E-S, they were raised in a tradition and have now left, as well as atheists. So we're talking about a huge range of people. So today's topic really focuses on those of us who are CPE supervisors or people who are directors of departments and want to provide some continuing education for their own chaplains so that we can serve people from these groups in a much better way. Next week, we'll be back and we'll be focusing on specifically how this applies to American Jews as a special subgroup where the patterns are a little bit different. So that's also an important topic, which we'll take on next week. So again, a sign of beauty here. So long ago, I remember my dear supervisor, Randy Jones, saying, "You can only help another as far as you have gone yourself." And I think back to that so often when I'm pushing my own learning and growing edges as a supervisor and as someone trying to follow what's happening in American religion. And in order to teach this material, we first have to start with ourselves as supervisors, ourselves as managers and directors of pastoral care. So last time we looked at the code of ethics. Today I want to just look at objectives and outcomes and think about these as applying to ourselves and not just to students. So we need to develop our own competence in being aware of the various groups that are present in our institution. So we're going to need to know who they are, what are some of the things that have made them who they are, and what ministry and pastoral care or spiritual care might look like to them. We're going to need to work on our own pastoral formation, perhaps, especially if we have not before thought of our own spiritual care as including people who are non-religious. as well as pastoral reflection. And pastoral reflection is going to be a place where students especially will do a whole lot of learning, but we also may need to do learning and discover that our own faith and our own understanding of who we are as chaplains and as CPE supervisors and department directors needs a little bit of adjustment as the people that we serve are changing. So this is an important thing for all of us to do learning in. So we have learning to do in the areas of information about the non-religious in our context, our own attitudes toward the non-religious, and the skills and art of providing spiritual care to the non-religious, just as our students and staff chaplains do. So why is this really so complicated in practice? Because I think it is complicated. Almost all CPE supervisors, department heads, and most CPE students are formed by religious or spiritual traditions, and we are invested in those traditions. And they provide the worldview with which we see the world. And so it takes some pushing of growing edges to see the integrity and the challenges of a non-religious worldview. It requires significant maturity in psychological and spiritual development, and it may require that we do some growing in order to get there. And in terms of skills, we need to become fluent in what Wendy Cadge and sociologists of religion call code switching, so that we can do the work that we know how to do, but using different language with which to do it. So this is hard. This is a cartoon, comes from a guy whose moniker as a cartoonist is Naked Pastor, and you can see his work on the Etsy website. And the person walking with Jesus in this case is saying, "Jesus, I'm afraid I'm losing my faith." And Jesus says, "Sucks, don't it?" And the point here is that we also, like our students, need to trust the process. There may be times when we feel like we're losing ourselves, the profession as we've known it, and perhaps our faith. We need to trust that we will have new versions of those things that include more of reality when we are done with the process. And we need to just trust the process like we ask our students to do. The spiritual care task, as I've said before, is the same. So with any person before us, we need to do spiritual assessment and identify areas of spiritual strength, areas of spiritual distress, make a spiritual care plan, building on the person's strengths in order to decrease spiritual distress and increase spiritual well-being. And the part that we need perhaps to grow on is this using the patient's language of meaning. And this is a piece that may take a lot of practice. And then, as always, we evaluate our approach and we adjust the plan that we've made as necessary. So here's a beautiful picture by a photographer named Galen Morgan. And I'm using this as an example of how some Christian students may see the world through a window of the Christian cross. So they're looking out at the world through this image of the cross. And part of the work to get ready to work with the non-religious is to see if we and they can learn to see the sacred in this way too, without the window of, in this case, the cross, just the beauty of the ocean and the sun. And we don't know whether it's a sunrise or a sunset. And here's a Jewish metaphor for this. So here is a calendar in the Jewish tradition, the year 5775. And that's a very different way of looking at time, much more in touch with the natural world and what's happening. And can we help people who experience time in this way also experience the sacredness in time that comes from this solar format that we use in the larger culture, which is just generic and you fill in the numbers and we don't pay a lot of attention to what's happening in the natural world. So I use these as metaphors for some of the stretching that all of us need to do when we're moving from religious or spiritual worldviews into a non-religious worldview so that we can care for someone well. Another reason that this becomes complicated is that more and more of our students will be secular. Admittedly, in Boston, we're seeing this maybe more and sooner than in some other parts of the country. But here's a New York Times article from 2015, October 16th, and the article was entitled "Secular but Feeling a Call to Divinity School," and commenting on the increase in numbers of people going to divinity school and seminary who are not affiliated with a particular tradition or are non-believers, as some might call them. And that certainly makes it complicated. So we need to look at our attitudes. And that's the next piece that I want to talk with us about today. So I'm going to present some tools to help us explore our attitudes and assumptions. So your attitude may be like this sculpture on the left, which is a figure of Jesus covering his face in horror. This is a sculpture at the Oklahoma City National Memorial. Or it may be thrilled and happy like the Buddha on the right. So no matter where you find yourself in terms of attitudes, there may be some surprises as you work through this material. So, and a tool that I often use with students is very simple. I ask students to brainstorm associations to the word religion. And I write them up on a whiteboard or a blackboard. And then we look at those words. And typically, we will see that some of those words are positive in connotation, some are negative in connotation, some are ambivalent in connotation. And we can then wonder aloud about how the fact that we are chaplains may impact what that list of words and the attitudes they represent, how our being chaplains impacts that. And we can ask ourselves then, how might the attitudes that we're carrying impact a first visit with someone who has come into an institution with a self-identification as none, N-O-N-E. And then you can do the same thing with the word spiritual, because as we talked about last week, some people are allergic to the word religion, other people may be allergic to the word spiritual. And then you could also do the same thing with the word atheist and see what kind of attitudes come forth from that. So this is a really simple and quick way to get at some of the attitudes that we must work with within ourselves in order to be ready to offer spiritual care to non-religious people. Here's another tool. An experience of religious or spiritual change seminar. I often have students write essays on particular religious or spiritual themes and following a particular template, and then each student reads their essay and we talk about those essays, how different they are. And here the goal would be to have students write about changes in their own religious and spiritual lives, changes in their beliefs, changes in their practices, and what led to the changes in their lives. And then encourage students to respond to their peers, especially to those who are most different from themselves. So this gives people a chance to practice talking to others whose experience is very different from their own, which is a skill in itself that we can practice in the educational component of CPE. And what I want from this is for people to understand, building from their own experience, that sometimes changes in belief, practice, belonging have their own integrity. They're important, they are based in profound experience, and they have integrity. And this will loosen up for some students their openness to people who are non-religious. This particular tool comes from John Mabry, who is a spiritual director, and he's written both articles and books that are widely available. And he has created this wheel that describes a range of religious and spiritual perspectives. So if you start in the lower right, you've got traditional believers, and then if you go clockwise, liberal believers, spiritual eclectics, religious agnostics, ethical humanists, and fallen believers. And what John Mabry says is that people move around this circle during the course of their life, and usually the motivations for moves are serious illness, grief, unexpected crises, spiritual epiphanies, exposure to other cultures or beliefs, as well as normal human development. And we in chaplaincy, mostly who work in healthcare, have all these motivators in our setting. So there are people in our care who are feeling the stress of needed change to move their place on this wheel. So if we are more comfortable with how we have changed, we will be more comfortable helping other people find their own place in change. Some of the questions that you might ask students when you look at this wheel is to identify where you are on Mabry's wheel. And did you start there in your adult life, or have you shifted? What did the shift feel like? And then providing spiritual care to which point on the wheel is the biggest challenge for you? So everybody's going to have some place on that wheel, probably, that's quite hard for them in terms of providing spiritual care. And on some points in the wheel, there will be particular temptations, given our own location on the wheel, temptations about wanting to move people before or when they are not ready. So that Faith Styles wheel is a great tool. It might involve the reading of at least an article so that people understand the concepts. And this will certainly get at attitudes and changes, and when is it all right to support people in change that is being motivated from them, and how to work with our own temptations to move people's beliefs when that is motivated from our own issues and not from theirs. This tool I've called Bridging Worldviews. And again, this is to help loosen up people's sense of being very tied to the parameters of a given religious or spiritual path. So you can ask students to describe an aspect of their own tradition that they're not comfortable with, and give an example of when they experience this discomfort. And then describe a powerful or formative spiritual experience that you've had outside your own tradition. And name something outside your tradition that you would include on your own list of something greater than myself, which we talked about last time. Part of spirituality is having relationship to something greater than oneself. And some of these are apt to be outside one's religious tradition, and yet they motivate who you are and who you hope to become. So all of these are designed to help loosen the sense of being limited by the parameters of a particular tradition. And again, it's a chance for students to practice talking to people who are particularly different from them, because we usually find it easier to talk with people who are like us as opposed to who are not like us. So here's a tool that comes out of internal family systems as a theory. And with this tool, you could explain the basics of the theory, ask each student to take a minute to identify a part of themselves that responds positively to religion and spirituality, and a part of themselves that responds negatively to religion and spirituality. And then you've got some options. You can ask them to write a verbatim between these two parts of themselves, and then different ones of these will be important for different students or staff chaplains when they are offering spiritual care within their own tradition, or when they're offering spiritual care across tradition, so someone from a tradition quite unlike theirs, or to someone who's left their tradition. That can be a hot button for some people, as can offering spiritual care to someone with no tradition at all. And you might even give students the choice of which one of those they want to write a verbatim between, and then share those and discuss those in class. So it's a way of finding out more about what is happening internally. And so we want to ask students what they learned by doing this. And what did they learn that was new? Did they discover that they had some hot button issues that they didn't know about, or situations that are particularly costly for them in offering spiritual care? Someone may be very good at offering spiritual care to someone who left their own tradition, but it's very costly to them to do it. So that would be a good thing to know. And then to come out of that with a sense of what their growing edges are that they might want to work on. So now we're going to switch from primarily focusing on attitudes to talking about tools for teaching skills, because skills are certainly part of the work that we do. So the first thing I would suggest is to really explore your own context. And you can certainly start by reading the Pew Study of Religion in America. The most recent version of that is 2015. And you can drill down in that study and explore in conversation with your students or your staff, what are the demographics of your area religiously? Are they changing? If so, in what way? Are the demographics of your institution different from the demographics of the community in which you work? For many of us, that's true. And just play a little bit with what might be the unique spiritual needs of persons in your setting and what skills might be needed to provide for them. So again, this is taking a big idea and bringing it closer to home to your particular setting. I've really enjoyed treasure hunts with students. It's a playful way to do some learning. And you might give students the task of, over the course of a week, make a list of the signs that they see of secular spirituality in your institution in a given week. And they might just write them down, or if they have permission, they might take photos. And then at the end of the week, talk about what they learned. So last time we met, we looked at the secular altar, which was the windowsill in a child's room with symbols for hope, symbols for power, symbols for guardian angels, as things that a particular mother believed in, although she said she was not religious. So here are some samples of things you might find. And this is not complete by any means. So one of the most common, something greater than oneself that is not directly religious or spiritual, is family. So this is just a picture of a family in a frame that says it's all about family. And many patients and their families would share that particular value. Many people find flowers or the beauty of the outdoors a common something greater than themselves. So why do we bring flowers to people in the hospital? It is something about spirituality that is connected there. Humor. So this photograph was taken at a children's hospital, and you can see that the child is really enjoying just the humor of this with the plunger instead of the stethoscope being used and being placed on her head. And spiritually, I would say that this really speaks to the issue of meaning and absurdity. So yes, there's love in this picture and belonging, but for a parent watching, it's also speaking to the absurdity of their child being ill. So it's a really creative way to lighten that issue in a pediatric hospital situation. More and more of our institutions have therapy dogs, visiting dogs. So here's a sweet little dog who has on his visiting vest. Many patients who won't speak to chaplains will speak to dogs very freely, will cuddle with dogs, will invite them up to snuggle and so on. And dogs are apt to represent unconditional love, belonging. They may bring back sweet memories of dogs at home, dogs from childhood, and so on. Any of the meditative practices of the hands. So here's a woman knitting, and you might see that at a bedside or in a waiting area. One of my physician students years ago taught me this by allowing someone who needed to take her knitting all the way up until she went into the operating room, because it was her way of coping with anxiety pre-op. And so here we have a spiritual practice, although it is secular. This is a hospital newsletter, and if you look at most hospitals' PR materials and marketing materials, you will find echoes of spirituality in them, because they want to present the work that they do as of utmost importance and worthy of people donating and worthy of people coming to their institution. What I found amazing about this particular one is it's called Shrine, S-H-R-I-N-E, and it is an invitation to use research information that's population-based and accessible at Harvard. And they picked a religious word to speak of how important it was. So now let's talk about code switching. Code switching is switching the kinds of words we use from religious and spiritual language to secular language in order to do our work. And you might practice with your students, have a session in which you work with your spiritual assessment tool, whatever it is, and for each theme, you might do pairs. What might a theme look like sound like in religious or spiritual language? And then what might that exact same theme sound like in secular language? So that people get much more competent at hearing it when it presents itself in secular language. And this just takes practice. It can be fun and playful. We talked last time about open-eyed prayer. So again, not prayer, but a secular version of offering a blessing of some kind, although that's a religious word, but a way to complete and round off and offer good wishes to the person that you have visited. So if in a verbatim students have prayed with a patient, you might ask them to translate that prayer when they present it in class into secular open-eyed prayer. What would it sound like? You might call on students to offer open-eyed prayer at the end of a session. I often negotiate with students who are wanting to learn how to do spontaneous prayer that I may call on them at the end of the session to offer prayer. And this is just a variety of that for people who want to learn how to do this open-eyed secular prayer skill. I have students right now who are working on taking beloved liturgical prayers and translating them into secular language that speaks more directly to patients. And that's another interesting tool. Invite a non-religious speaker for conversation with your students. So this is like a speaker's bureau kind of thing. So ask someone that you know who is not religious, who is willing to come and have a very open conversation with students. Ask them to share their spiritual journey, whatever it's looked like, and invite students to ask the person whatever questions they're curious about. And then together with the speaker and the students, wonder together about how a sensitive chaplain might approach this guest if the guest were a patient. And you'll get feedback from the guest about what would be comfortable, not comfortable, and so on. So I really like the Speaker's Bureau idea for teaching students when we're working with new demographics for them. So somebody who's really willing to be asked anything so that conversations can be frank and as helpful as possible. I might assign students to do at least one of their verbatims on their work with a secular person. And then if that person is presenting the verbatim, ask the student to identify the patient's areas of spiritual distress, spiritual strength, spiritual resources, and their own spiritual care plan, but using the patient's own secular language so that the patient would recognize it as belonging to them. And now we get to another way of working with a verbatim with a secular person, and this one overlaps a lot with attitudes. So here we might ask our students what their own theological reflections are on the encounter. So they would be free to use religious or spiritual language. And then you might wonder together, if you worked long-term with this person, do you think that your own theology would change or not? And how do you feel about your answer to the question in terms of your own pastoral identity and authority? and what is really at stake theologically for you. And this particular question has been raised very well by Balboni in a 2013 article called A Theological Assessment of Spiritual Assessments. And he's really focusing on this question of integrity. And it's a really important question to work with students around. I often encourage my students over the course of a CPE unit to create their own little resource book that they might find useful over time in different spiritual care situations. And you can certainly do this with secular resources as well. So you want to encourage them to find some new language and metaphors that are outside the traditions that they come from. And this might include poetry, music, art, books of photographs. My own personal spiritual care library here has a lot of books of photographs that we work with elders with. And sometimes people will make a personal resources book as one of their projects in a CPE unit. Some other possible assignments. Plan a secular memorial service for a non-religious person. And that can be either easy or very challenging depending on the student and the person, but it's really good practice. As is planning a service for your institution following a trauma. So the student could identify what the trauma is, but here in Boston, hospitals did a lot of services after the Boston Marathon bombing. And the challenge of working with something like that is to think about a service that will meet needs of people who are religious and spiritual and those who are not. And how do you create a service that is welcoming of all those perspectives? And then each student can present their service, and then there's discussion. What were the challenges of putting this together? And how do the students feel about the depth of meaning and hope and comfort in each one? Because we don't want to lose depth in order to do breadth. So, in summary, I've taken you through 3 basic steps. Seeking out contextualized information, first yourself, and then having your students or staff do it. Tools to work at keeping an attitude of compassionate curiosity, of open-heartedness in working with the non-religious. And then some tools to keep developing skills over the course of one's career. So we as supervisors need to keep developing our skills over a lifetime, just the way we hope that students will keep developing skills over the course of a CPE unit. So that's the end of this part, and now I welcome questions and comments from all of you. So I'll give you a few moments to send in some questions. Perhaps some of you have additional tools that you've used that you would like to share as well, that would be welcome too. Okay, here's a question. With the Speakers Bureau idea, you hear their spiritual story and ask the speaker questions, and then you discuss how to give spiritual care to that person. Do you do that last part with the person present? I would say yes. I'm not sure whether people heard me answer before. So the question was, with the Speakers Bureau idea, you hear their story and ask the speaker questions, and then you discuss how to give spiritual care to that person, and do you do that with the person present? I would, so that the students and you get immediate feedback from the speaker as to how the various approaches might be experienced by her or him. And that's a good reality check. So something that sounds great in the classroom might not work so well with the speaker herself or himself. So I would do it together, and that means that the speaker that you invite needs to be very open and honest in their willingness to share their response. Okay, here we go. How do you help the student keep their own integrity regarding their own religion and spirituality and not be condescending to the patient with no religious interest? So it's a great question. And in some ways, it's the challenge of doing this teaching and this work. And we never want to be condescending to the people that we're caring for. And we always want to respect the integrity of the students that we're working with or the staff chaplains that we're working with. I don't assume ahead of time where a student will get in terms of open-heartedness, in terms of their own integrity. And I don't set bars of what I expect someone to reach. But I do hope that the experience of getting to know a patient deeply and working with them will surprise them and open their heart in ways that they may not have expected at first. It's always true that a chaplain can recuse themselves if someone is too different or for particular personal reasons they just can't go there with a student. But one of the reasons we work so much on the attitudes part is because of that issue of integrity and not being patronizing or condescending to people without faith. I want some of those exercises to help students see that there is integrity in each person's spiritual journey. Okay. This is interesting. How might one help someone who's not religious identify spiritual issues and questions? Might you name the issue as specifically spiritual? So I might ask them if do they feel like this is a spiritual issue for them. I'm going to let them tell me, because as we talked about the last time, some people are really allergic to being told that they're spiritual. when in their own sense of integrity, they are not spiritual and not religious. And so we don't want to impose that on someone. We're going to just drive them away, drive distance between us in a way that we can no longer be supportive of them. One of the fascinating things that we talked about last time is how often people have parts of themselves that are religious and spiritual, and at the same time parts of them that are secular and not spiritual. And if you've got someone like that, and that's thought to be about 40% of the population, then it may be just fine to ask, does this feel like it's a spiritual question to you? And they may say yes, and that opens up some more language to use. But you want to assess, is that language appropriate before you just go into using it. Okay, let's see. What else? I'm assuming this is here's a supervisor. We had an atheist student this past summer who really challenged us to be more inclusive in our language and worship. He brought a deep spirituality and allowed us all to struggle with him on what integrity is for us in chaplain. And then it seems to cut off. In a way, this is an example, I think, of, or similar to a speakers bureau where you have someone come in who's willing to share and give responses to students and their language and their attitudes and so on. I think it often is when we have students who are way outside our own realm that we learn the most. For me, as a Christian coming into a Jewish organization, I have had a lot of language to change in order to speak to my students. And we need, as a discipline, I believe, to be able to grow in this way of being more inclusive in language and worship. So I think it's exciting that you had this opportunity, and I think that more and more of us will be having this opportunity as more unaffiliated people go to seminary and show up in our CPE program. Could you give a brief example of non-religious service content? What possible components are parts of this service? So I think it's the difference between sort of prayer and open-eyed prayer and a religious memorial service, say, and a non-religious memorial service. So a lot of it has to do with language and the choice of readings, the choice of music, what kind of language is used in a homily or in remembrance of the person. Fortunately now, for those of us who work in geriatrics or in hospice, there are many books that have resources for memorial services for people who are secular. So it really has to do, again, with language. And we want to personalize a memorial service to the individual just the way we do when someone is religious, and they may have had particular authors, readings, songs, music that they loved, and it would be appropriate to use those. Okay, here's a really challenging one. I've been working with a student who continues to be oblivious to her frame of reference, that of a Pentecostal Christian, that continues to get in her way of actually giving care to non-believers. I appreciate some of your ideas. I wonder which one will crack the shell. So I, of course, have no idea which, if any, of these will crack the shell. One of the things that I have come to do over time when I interview students for CPE is that I ask them to tell me about a belief or practice of their own that has changed over time. And what I'm really looking for here is the capacity to let experience change them and, in a sense, open them up. So if you're someone who works with Keegan, I want to know that people are able to move from a 3 to a 4. And if people cannot say that they have ever had growth in their belief or their practice, then I'm apt to think that CPE may not be the best learning situation for them. I want to know that someone is open enough to grow, even if it's an incremental amount in CPE. So that's a real challenge. You might play. I'm just thinking aloud, but you might play with some role playing about talking about giving spiritual care across tradition, and as someone who's not from the student's tradition, give spiritual care in the chaplain's tradition, and see how that feels to the Pentecostal student. Do they feel uncomfortable? And then can they make the connection that if they're feeling uncomfortable having somebody want them to be in a different place than they are, might that be happening when they're the chaplain relating to other people? So that is a real challenge. It's why I talked about how frightening and fearful this work can be. How do we invite non-religious, secular patients and families to meet with chaplains without the words chaplain or spiritual care scaring them off? That's a good question. Sometimes I think it will be by referral. So someone else on the team may say, you know what? I know somebody on our team who's really, really good at talking about loss. And I promise you that this person will listen to you really well and is wise. And I think that you would find yourself feeling comforted by talking to this person. Her name is Jane Smith, and I'll ask her to come. And Jane Smith can come and say, hi, I'm Jane Smith, nurse, whatever, suggested that I come. And you might say in a very nonchalant way that you're, in my case, I'm Mary Martha Teal, and one of the members of the team. I'm the chaplain, which means I'm the person who helps talk about the meaning of these events in people's lives. So you do a little interpretation to get away from the word that may be scary. I think we do owe it to the people we work with for them to know who we are. That's a patient right, and I interpret that as not just the name, but what our role is. see what else have come in. When working with other traditions, do you network them with others of their tradition or try to enter a spiritual place with them? So I'm assuming that this is a chaplain who's meeting with someone across tradition. I'm certainly going to encourage myself and my students and so on to enter a spiritual place with them first. They may have their own religious leader from a congregation, and if that's so, we want to welcome that person into our institution, and part of our chaplaincy job is to offer hospitality to them. But I'm not going to write off the possibility that I can be helpful to the patient. I think that human beings are at core human, and we have lots of similarities, especially in the huge existential questions that chaplains deal with. And we may be familiar with them in different language and through different cultures, but the dynamics themselves are very similar. So I'm certainly going to try first. And one of the reasons that I would do that first is that what we don't know is what the style of the spiritual care will be of somebody who on the books may match the patient, but we know nothing about their preparedness to do spiritual care that is respectful of the patient. So I'm hesitant to blindly call in somebody else to work with a patient because I feel protective of them. How does one pray in a secular way that is outside of their theological understanding of prayer? So we talked about this a little bit in the first webinar, and what I would say is to talk about this open-eyed prayer. The prayer functions in a number of ways in a pastoral visit, and it can sum things up, it can help people feel heard, it can strengthen the relationship between the chaplain and the patient, it can help put the patient's situation in a larger perspective, and in some way express the possibility of hope, at least the possibility of hope. And one can do all that without the trappings of theological prayer. So one can wish for someone the things that one might put in a prayer. And the issue of it being outside their theological understanding of prayer, that's an attitude question, I think, as well as a skill question. And I actually haven't had that come up with students, because if I say to someone, I hear so clearly how lonely you are today, I really hope that that will change. I do believe it will not always feel the way that it feels today. I will hold you in my heart until I'm able to come visit again. Something like that. Now, that's a secular way of dealing with material that would often be put in a prayer. I've never had a student who found that objectionable theologically, because everything that, in that case, I am saying is true for me, although it's translated into a different vernacular. So now I think we're about at 1 o'clock.
Yep, our time has come to an end. So thank you to Reverend TL for today's session and to everyone for joining us today. And our third webinar in the series, Spiritual Care of Jews Who Identify as Non-Religious, will take place on Wednesday, March 2nd. Please be sure to visit the ACPE Academy page on the ACPE website to sign up for this webinar, as well as for information about future webinars. And as a reminder, this recording will also be available on the website along with the presentation early next week. Thanks so much for joining us, and we wish you a wonderful day.